So we had sort of a discussion about macroeconomics, what it is and all that business. I want to put the lights a little bit lower though. Ooh, is that too low? Is that better? Okay, let's go with that. So what are we going to talk about then in this macroeconomics course? Talk about something called GDP, something called unemployment, deal with things called prices and money, and the fact that people have different opinions about how this whole thing works. So I guess the real difference between micro, what you did before, and macro now, is that a lot of people find macroeconomics a little bit easier to engage with because they've heard about these things, unemployment. Like you're sitting in a taxi and on the radio it says something about the Reserve Bank changed interest rates. It's like the back of your mind, you've heard these things. Whereas in microeconomics, we're talking about how does a firm decide how much capital to use in its production process. And you're like, what is a firm? What is a production process? I've never come across these things. So a lot of people kind of identify with this one, macroeconomics, a lot more. But having said that, I would argue that it's a lot more difficult trying to get a good mark in this one because there's a lot of stuff and it all intermingles. And it gets, by the time you're at the end of this course, there's a big weight on your shoulders to try and put it all together. So do bear in mind this is a tricky course. I don't apologize for that. I'm just saying be prepared. So what I want to do then is sort of on the basis of what it is that we're discussing, just guide you briefly through this mind map. So firstly, we're just discussing the subject matter. Then what we're going to do is talk about different macroeconomic variables and how you measure them. And that's kind of the topic for this week and next week. Now, one of the things, just in terms of GDP here, if I just go back over here quickly, GDP, the components of GDP in terms of the expenditure approach, these are our components. We've got consumption, investment, government spending, and international transactions. Now, these all represent different parts of the consumption side of an economy. So they kind of represent what you would call the demand side. This is where everything goes. Everything that gets produced, where does it go? It gets demanded, it gets consumed. So after talking about what macro variables we're going to be dealing with, we then kind of we're going to talk about the demand side of the economy. And then after that, we're going to talk about the supply side. So the demand side is people buying stuff. This is where does stuff go? And supply side, who produces stuff? So people buying stuff, people making stuff and selling. And then we just bring those two together, demand and supply, and we have our goods market. But the goods market is not the only kind of market that we have in the macro sphere. We also have other markets like the money market. In other words, there's intermediaries between these people buying and selling. And there's intermediate goods that we use. One of those goods, or the most common good, is money. And then in dealing with money, we're going to have to deal with banking and the bond market and the stock market. These are all different intermediary or markets that are not the goods market but are related to the goods market. So when we have the goods market and the financial market, and the most important financial market being the money market, then what we can do is we can bring the goods market and the money market together in another model called the ISLM. So the IS represents the goods market, the LM represents the money market, and we'll talk more about that. Then we need to talk about other players in this market. So we're talking about people buying stuff, we're talking about people making and selling stuff. But something that we didn't have in the microeconomic sphere was the fact that the people or the agents that are buying things are not just people. We also have governments, right? So government will deal with something called fiscal policy. We've also got another institution called the Reserve Bank, South African Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank affects the money market supply of things. So here we have a big government agency called the government affecting the goods market. We've got another one affecting the money market. And of course by the ISLM we'll see that each one of those markets has an effect on the other market. So at this stage you should start seeing how everything is very much intertwined. And it can get quite complicated. So we spoke, when we were looking at the expenditure components of GDP, there was something called consumption, which is households, then you have investment, which is firms, Then you have government spending, which was government. And now we've got another agent, which is people outside of our economy. So we're also engaged in international trade. So we need to talk more about that. And then finally, somewhere towards the end of the course, we're going to talk more about South Africa, because we are here. Right? What does our economy look like? What are these things that we've looked at, these concepts, these ideas? How do they apply to the South African context? So then we've got Statistics South Africa collects data, the Treasury collects data, the Reserve Bank collects data, and we're going to talk more about what those organizations do. Apart from monetary or fiscal policy, what is it that they actually do specifically in the South African economy? And that is a broad overview of everything. Okay. So then, without further ado, we can go back to where we were, which was, what is it that we're doing? Well, GDP, and we said GDP, we can look at it from the consumption side of things. C, I, G, X, and M. Sometimes we throw T in there as well for taxes. X for exports, M for imports. Oops, sorry. And then, you know, this, like I said, not necessarily agreement on how these things work. I don't necessarily agree with some of the things that are said in this book, and I'd be happy for you to disagree with things so that we can have a discussion about them as well. And in terms of those different opinions, I put this down, but I actually don't think we're going to discuss the different opinions too much. But the main kind of ones that you might come across are Keynesian economics, classical economics, neoclassical economics, monetarists, people who deal with real business cycle theory, rational expectations theory. These are all like different opinions on how economic stuff happens. So if you're someone who likes to engage in a thought process where the answer is not necessarily clear, maybe someone who likes philosophy, then this is the kind of thing that you can engage in from that perspective. There's no right answer necessarily, just people arguing about what's best.